Okay, folks, since we started this session as an asynchronous class, and it was originally set up to be a hybrid, it was inevitable that I would forget to include a few things at the beginning that needed to be there. And one of those is an overall viewpoint of what I like to refer to as an empirical research process, because we tend to have a lot of misunderstandings about research, and we tend to think of research as something that fits a certain mold or fits a certain style or a certain paradigm, when in reality it's all part of what I call an empirical process. Empirical processes really kind of have their starting point or their origin out of Greek philosophy, and in particular out of Aristotle's notion of realism. Prior to his discussion of the notions of realism, we believed things to be true simply because they were, part of a universal law or part of something that the gods would reveal to us when we got smart enough to understand it. And Aristotle wasn't willing to accept that, and basically he came to the conclusion that nothing could be real, that if it couldn't be interact with the senses. In other words, if you couldn't taste it or see it or feel it or hear it or whatever, then it wasn't real. And so he had developed this notion of realism as a philosophical viewpoint, and out of that spun the notions of empirical processes. And empirical processes were basically early sort of discussions of research. I have over the years done a lot of research in using quantitative methodologies, using qualitative methodologies, using mixed methodologies, and so it has occurred to me that outside of the obvious distinctions that we make in terms of qualitative and quantitative, they really do follow a similar process line. And by process line, I mean that there are kind of stages that you go through, or steps or questions you answer, or whatever you want to call them, that you go through, and it's just a difference as to whether where those things are coming from, as to whether they end up being quantitative or qualitative. And so I want to talk about the empirical process first. We'll get to the quantitative and qualitative stuff later in the course, and that course will be explained kind of on its own. But we need first to kind of get the umbrella and the overview. And this is not going to be terribly philosophical, because the philosophical pieces will come in another video, and we'll focus strictly on things like positivism and post-positivism and those sorts of ideas. But we will not do that in this video. This will simply kind of lay out this empirical process and what are the steps in that process. And so let me share the handout up. I think you have it in your packet on As You Learn. And okay. In thinking about what could go in this course in terms of these empirical processes, we really are dealing with the first 5 stages or steps here: posing questions, determining what we know, refining questions, determining the data needs, and then designing the research. If we followed the whole process through, then we would actually do the research, basically collect and analyze the data, report the results for peer review. Research never stops at that point. It always goes for peer review because you want to know what your colleagues think of it. You want to know what people in the field that have done similar sorts of research and all think of it. And then determining where to go next. I mean, what do we do next? Where does the research go? Or, you know, how do we extend it, or how do we put it in a different context? Or, you know, are there other questions that have come up that now we need to kind of deal with those questions? And so all of these stages that we go through are really important stages. And we'll kind of walk through those and put a little explanation on it. And so you can kind of see where we're going. First, you have to pose a question. I mean, the question has to be based on the context that the question emerges from. It has to be based upon a solid construct. Research questions begin as either a hypothesized relationship, which is an example of deductive logic. In other words, you start with a hypothesis and you test it. You create a methodology to test it. Or it has to be based on a theory, a theoretical introduction, a theoretical starting point. And that tends to be more inductive in nature, in that you don't really know what the relationships might be, but you're wanting to understand them a little bit better, and you're wanting to identify variables that you might not know about, or be able to hypothesize relationships that you can't now do. And typically we talk about deductive being more the quantitative side and inductive being more the qualitative side. That's not 100% true, but it is, you know, it's 90-95% true. But there are instances in which we do a deductive study that is done in a qualitative manner, and we do an inductive study that's done in a quantitative manner, but typically it's the other way around. After we start with a question, and these are preliminary questions, these are kind of broad based questions, and you know, Trocum has kind of a visual for this, where he starts with an hourglass, and at the top, you know, we start with a concept and we narrow it and focus it down. But the second step, and always the second step, is to determine what we already know about it. You know, we don't need to think about doing original starting at the beginning necessarily. If we already know a whole lot about the beginning, we might be able to start at the next step, or the next rung up on the ladder. And so we need to know what other people have concluded and what other people have found about the same subject area, or the topic that we're interested in. Now, the research process involves a peer review component because there are so many things that we can get wrong, and there are so many different variables that can impact a research study, confounds we call them, that we really can't know much about because we're not looking for them, we don't see them. And so we really need to understand that when we finish a piece of research, the next step, and always the next step, is that it goes for peer review. Well, in the literature, it's important to look at peer-reviewed material. And typically peer-reviewed material are things like that go into an edited text source. You know, sometimes you'll put together a volume, somebody will put together a volume on a particular topic, and there'll be a lot of articles or pieces in there, or research studies in there from different researchers, different individuals. And so it's important to know that literature needs to be peer reviewed, or you can look at conference proceedings, or you can look at presentations that have been presented at conferences. You can also look into the primary source or professional journals that are designed to provide help provide the knowledge base for different professional areas. And so we're always looking for peer reviewed. We're kind of steering away from, you know, popular press. We're kind of steering away from proprietary press, you know, those things that people that have developed a model to do something, and of course they will share with you their literature that talks about how great and wonderful it is. And so we're more interested in peer review articles simply because they have kind of stood the test of the process. And so we know that, they're going to be more objective, perhaps, than other things we might look at. There's a common misperception that at a literature review, you're building a case to support what you think you will find. Because researchers all have biases, and sometimes they're blatant, sometimes they're hidden, and sometimes they're just systematic in the way that we do things. And so we need to be checked against our biases. And so, when we have literature reviews that are peer reviewed, that's what happens. We don't, they're supposed to be objective. They're supposed to provide the breadth of the case that we're trying to make, how people look at it both ways, or however many different ways there are. And with only the 8 or 10 or 12 that you're going to be doing for this class, it's kind of hard to get a real balance there, but it's important to have as much balance as possible. And then if you do a much bigger piece, a research article or a thesis or dissertation, you certainly would want there to be a lot of balance. Based on that literature review and what you find in the lit review, the questions almost inevitably get refined a certain extent, and they get clarified. And if you find that there's a lot of stuff in the literature about something, and we have a pretty good sense about it, then we're doing more of a confirmatory type questions. In other words, we're asking very specific questions to see if a particular setting, particular context, a particular grade level, a particular program supports what's in the literature and displays what's in the literature. If we're a little bit less clear on how much work has been done, or whether there might be gaps in the literature and there's an obvious hole there that needs to be filled in some way, or a take on something that nobody else has taken, then we have more exploratory questions. Now, typically confirmatory questions are more deductive in nature because you start with a hypothesis. Exploratory questions are a little more inductive in nature because you don't know quite where it's going to take you, and you're just trying to figure out, what can you know from looking at, the literature, and what else do we need to know. Now, after we've determined the type of question, and we've determined the types of questions, and determine, whether they're more exploratory, more confirmatory, then we have to determine what data we will need to answer those questions. And is that data, is it more discussion? Is it more narrative? Is it more chronological history? Is it more, quantitative? Is it more scores? What kind of data is it that you're going to need? And then can you access that data? Because it does no good to know what data you need if you can't have access to it, if you can't create an access point to it. And so as you talk about the data you need, you also have to think about the data that might be available. And so in doing those two things, you discover sometimes that maybe you don't have everything you need, and you don't have access to everything you need. And so you have to first solve those issues before you can actually you proceed and kind of design the study. Then you get to the point where you actually design the research. And typically we divide research methodologies into 3 categories, really 2 paradigms of methodology, quantitative and qualitative, and then mixed. Because sometimes you'll find that to answer particular questions, you have to use approaches that are not just one or not just the other, but are mixed approaches, and would have the benefit of some data that you might collect in each manner. And those are the kind of the 5 pieces that we'll deal with in this course. We've already posed the question the first time and refined it to a certain extent. you're in the midst of beginning to think about and doing a lit review, I think Cresswell has a really nice chapter 2 on lit reviews. And so if you didn't read those first 3 chapters of Cresswell, you need to go back and scoop them up and pay particular attention to chapter 2, which is on the lit review process. I've also provided some narrative examples of smaller lit reviews that have been done in other projects, and a synopsis chart that is helpful in figuring out how to use source material. Sometimes it's difficult to organize source material in a way that makes sense. And in and of itself, doing a lit review is a little bit of a research process, because you're trying to figure out, what are the commonalities, what are the pieces that work together, is there a flow to this, are there different sides to this? And so as you develop the lit review, it's good to have just a quick little notion of what's in each one of them. Now, years ago, I used to use synopsis charts a lot, and I've given you a kind of a framework to work with, and it lets you keep the basic key information out of an article in like one chart or one program, what might make it a little bit easier to see where the connections are and where the different things are. Otherwise, you just go through and you'll find yourself trying to go through, and you do, well, so-and-so said this, and so-and-so said that, and so-and-so said this. And that's really not the point of a lit review. The point of a lit review is that there are 2 sides to this, and so-and-so and so-and-so express one side of it, so-and-so, that kind of an organizational structure. And so, I provided you with that, and asked you to not only provide me with the chart, but also beginnings of a narrative, because you take material from the chart and you craft it into a narrative. We will go through a couple of iterations of this lit review, a couple of 3. So you don't have to, get it all tightly wound up the first go round. But you do have to have, the beginnings of it, beginning to talk about, what you have found, the synopsis chart to kind of show what are the important pieces. And so I've kind of limited to the reading material for this particular time frame, simply because you need to be reading literature related to your topics. We will come back with another draft, and it'll be the next thing up after the lit review piece, in which you combine the questions you posed and refined, and the beginnings of a lit review. And it'll be the, kind of the beginning of that process, and I will provide feedback on that. And then we will kind of begin to look at more of the design elements. We'll add, what are the things, the data points that you need to see, how might you go about collecting them, how might you think about that data, and how might you analyze that data. And then we'll get into the actual research design piece, in which we'll spend a lot of time with quantitative and qualitative. We'll talk about it some as we go along, but we'll save most of that until we get to the design elements. And that's all for the course. Now, if you were going to follow through the empirical process, after you had your design signed off on, and the institutional review boards had cleared it, you would actually do the research, which means collect and analyze the data. Report results for peer review. You would write it up and create a research report, an article, or a presentation to go to a conference, or go to try to get published in a journal, or go up on a bulletin board or something. But somewhere there has been some peer review that allows you to say, okay, well, might be what's right, this might be what's wrong with it. And so, peer review is an important part of the process. And then after that, then you determine what's next. Where does this go now? What direction do I go in? And so the process is relatively the same. Doesn't matter whether you think you're quantitative or qualitative or whatever you are. That actual decision is made much later in the game. Unfortunately, we have kind of separated folks into philosophical camps, and we'll talk about the philosophical stuff in the next little video after this. But we've separated people into philosophical camps that then have translated into research paradigms. And so we talk about quantitative researchers and qualitative researchers. And yeah, if you have a particular skill set one way or the other, obviously you would find it difficult to do the other, but you can only answer certain questions. You can't answer all questions in both manners. In fact, you can't answer many questions in both manners. Generally, the questions you ask will end up driving the methodology that has to be used. And so, you know, it's important to understand that you know, researchers, for whatever reason, we've kind of have this binary approach to things. My training was not in that way. My training was in the notion of having sort of mixed methodologies and being having a big toolbox that would allow me to work in both directions. And so that's kind of my bias, is that we ought to be doing more mixed method stuff. But you know, we're kind of where we are, and as we work through things, we'll hopefully I'll show you why we need to get out of this notion of thinking about purely quantitative or purely qualitative, and talk about the research process as opposed to paradigms of research. So hopefully this has helped clear some of that up. As I said, the little handout here is up on As You Learn. I will be adding more stuff to this over the next couple of days. The next video will be one dealing with philosophical underpinnings. That will probably come about, I have class tonight, so that'll probably come about tomorrow and go up as soon as possible after that. So hopefully this has been helpful. If you can, if you have questions or concerns, please get in touch. We'll set up a little meeting. I hope to have one-on-one meetings once we get past the lit review piece with everyone in the class. And if we need to meet a bit more than that, that will be perfectly fine. But you know, you have to let me know. I can't figure out, or I can't mystically figure out what it is that you don't understand or don't know. So you have to let me know, and we'll figure out a way to get you there. So that's the end of this one. And, you know, expect to see the philosophical one coming up in a day or so.